Anna, and welcome to another doll repaint video. So a couple of dolls ago, I made a doll based on the star card of the tarot deck. While working on the concept for this doll, I thought about adding constellations to her design. I then started reading about the different constellations and soon discovered that there are about 88 different ones charted by the International Astronomical Union, and most of them have really interesting myths and stories behind them. And seeing as I'm a sucker for mythology and folklore, I quickly came to the realization that I can't condense 88 constellations into one design. Oh no! This is going to have to be a whole new doll series. Now, I probably won't be making a doll for all 88 constellations, but I thought it would be a blast to pick a handful or so and make a doll that revolves around each one's story and symbology. I'm not going to be going in any particular order, it's just whatever grabs my attention, and today I am starting with the Lyre Constellation. Before we can jump into the doll work, we first have to talk about the actual constellation. Now, if you don't know, a lyre is a type of harp that was played in the age of ancient Greece. And this lyre was made by the god Hermes and gifted to Orpheus by his father, Apollo, the god of music. So to say that Orpheus was a talented musician would be a titan of an understatement. Now, if the name Orpheus sounds familiar to you, that's because he's been a part of numerous tales, and one of the most famous, and the one I'm basing this doll off on, focuses on his wedding day to the beautiful wood nymph Eurydice. On the day of Orpheus and Eurydice's wedding, the blushing bride was bitten by a poisonous snake and died in the arms of her new husband. Grief-stricken, Orpheus set off to the underworld to see if he could retrieve his bride from the king of hell, Hades. Now this is where the lyre comes into play, because to get past all of Hades' henchmen, Orpheus was able to charm them by playing his harp, and eventually was able to get an audience with Hades and his queen Persephone. Orpheus then played them a song about his love for Eurydice that moved Hades so much, he allowed them to leave the underworld together. But only if they walked all the way out of the underworld, with Orpheus walking in front and never turning to look back at Eurydice. They agree, of course, and they manage to walk almost all the way to the exit to the mortal realm. But by this point, Orpheus became worried that she wasn't there at all, and his paranoia got the best of him, and as he turned around, he saw her vanish back into the underworld. To honor Orpheus's talent and his love story with Eurydice, the muses cast his lyre up into the heavens, and that became the constellation we know today. So the story focuses on Orpheus's perspective, but for our doll, we're going to be making Eurydice. In the story, Orpheus gets in the way of his own happiness, and honestly, I think we can all really relate to that at some point. But it's really Eurydice who has to deal with the aftermath and the consequences of his actions. So our doll will be focusing on Eurydice facing those consequences while she waits for Orpheus to return. If you haven't read the story of Eurydice and Orpheus in its entirety, I highly encourage you to do so. It's one of the classics for a reason. But I think it's about time we get started on our doll, so enough talking, let's go to the underworld. To achieve the vision I have for our lyre doll, today I'm going to be merging 3 dolls into one. First, I'm going to be grave robbing the skeleton decoration's skull. Next, I'm pulling this Frankenstein doll out of my supply stock. This is one of those dolls where you press a button and she speaks. The head and body are made out of a plastic that's harder than a typical Monster High doll, and I've been saving this doll for the right project. The last doll I'll be using is the body from this Bonita femur doll. This doll came headless in a lot of dolls that I bought off eBay, and it's perfect for what I have planned. And don't worry, I will go into more concept details as we go along. To kick off my prep work, I'm starting with the body prep. I'm going to be using this doll's whole body, and right now, all I need to do is give it 3 coats of Mr. Super Clear Sealant. Easy peasy. For the skull prep, I'm going to pop it off and save the bones in my closet for future projects. Then, like my usual doll prep, I'm coming in with some pure acetone to remove the factory face paint from the eye sockets and nasal cavity. Now, with the Frankie doll, I plan on just using her face. The way that this doll is wired, using boiling hot water to detach her head won't work like usual, so I'm separating it from her body using wire cutters. Next up, before I can work on removing the face, I have to remove the rubber scalp that held in her old hair plugs. Here she is without the rubber top. You can see on the side of her head there's a seam that runs perfectly right behind the ear and would provide a clean line for her faceplate. The next part, I have to figure out how to remove the brain without cracking the seam or her face. And this will prove to be really tricky because of how hard the plastic is. I tried hammering it, I tried sawing it open, and eventually I had to risk using a wrench to crack it open like a walnut while trying to avoid cracking the whole thing. And in case you're wondering, this is what's inside the doll's head. Next up is removing the factory face paint with the same acetone we used before. As we start to remove it, you can see that the doll's head is actually made out of a thick, clear plastic. And now that the paint is off, this part of the doll will be getting sealed with Mr. Super Clear, of course, to provide a nice papery texture to apply pigments to later. So let's kick things off by starting with our doll's body. Like I said before, I chose to use a Bonita femur doll for a very specific reason. Well, 2 reasons actually. First, Eurydice is a wood nymph, so that insect-like fluff that's on Bonita's torso and legs could be interpreted as wood bark. And secondly, my doll focuses on the time Eurydice spends waiting for Orpheus to rejoin her in the underworld. I like to think that time in the underworld works a little bit differently. So the time that Orpheus spends on Earth actually ended up being thousands of years of Eurydice waiting for him. After all that waiting, she turns into a shriveled up pile of bones, and therefore Bonita's skeleton torso is perfect for this doll. To get started on the body, I first have to snip the neck off the skeleton. I plan on attaching the skull to Bonita's body, so to make things easier down the road, I'm going to attach this neck to the doll so I can use the skull's neck peg. The easiest way I could think to connect the neck to the body is by melting it on, so I'm using a soldering iron to first melt a hole in the plastic of the spinal cord and squishing it on to the neck portion of the body. Fortunately, it worked pretty well, and now to firmly attach the 2 pieces together, I'm going to use the soldering iron again to melt and smooth the plastic of the spine so it will snugly attach to the neck. Okay, to make it look like the body has been sitting there waiting for 1,000 years, I'm going to try to make it look like a shriveled, ashy pile of dusty old bones. I'm first going over the whole body with a couple layers of black pastels to almost give it a charred look. Next, I want to bring out the details of the wood grain of the legs and the skeleton, so I'll be dry brushing on some gold acrylic paint to highlight these details. I chose gold because in some of the stories, Orpheus treasured his love with Eurydice so much he never wed again. So I'm using gold to represent the purity of their love for each other. Now we're going to move on to the skull, and like her body, I want it to look like it's been sitting there forever, but not as drastic as the body repaint. Instead, I'm starting to weather the skull by contouring using a couple different shades of dark browns. I want to define all the little details of the skull. Blending the lighter and the darker shades will make it look like it has real shadows and contours. I want her skull to look realistic, so I'm taking some watered-down acrylic paints and spritzing them onto the entire skull. Real bone would have some texture, so doing this step pushes it a step forward from looking like plastic to looking like actual bone. Now I want the skull to look grimy, so I'm coming in with an even darker brown and black pastels to push the dirty, abandoned look. To make it look like she has individual teeth, I'm coming in with a watercolor pencil to define each one. I'm also going to be using watercolor pencils to really push the blacks of the eye sockets and the nasal cavity. For a final touch, I'm lightly patting on some gold paint here and there on the skull. Since the coloring is a bit different to the body, I want to add this touch to tie the two parts together. Using my finger will make the application look a little bit more organic than the heavy-handed application we applied to the body. For the next part of my doll's concept, I want to touch upon the idea of what could have been. Eurydice probably has a lot of time on her hands while she waits for Orpheus to return, so she probably spent a lot of time thinking about what could have been if she and Orpheus had made it out of the underworld together. What music they could have made together, the adventures they could have gone on, and probably even the children they would have had together. To represent that part of her humanity, I'm having her hold a mask of her former face. While she waits for Orpheus to return, she just can't let that part of herself go. So next up, we'll be turning Frankie's face into Eurydice's human face mask. Because we're making a mask, I wanted clean lines around the edges, so that's why I chose to use a doll made out of a hard plastic instead of a rubber doll. Once cut, the rubbery plastic likely wouldn't have had clean edges, and it would have been really difficult to work with. For the mask, I'll be treating it like I would a typical doll repaint. I've started by painting the plastic of the mask with acrylics mixed for her base skin tone color. Next, I'll be doing my usual subdermal color zone work to make her skin look realistic. These colors will make it look like she has blood and muscle under her skin, and if you want to learn more, be sure to check out my Medusa repaint video where I cover the basics of subdermal colors. Like the skull, I gave her skin some texture by spraying on some watered-down acrylic paints, which will give her skin the appearance of freckling and blemishes. Now I'm working on contouring and highlighting her face. Just like with the skull, she needs shadows on her face to look realistic. I applied these tones to the same areas that you would add contouring makeup, and this makes certain areas look like they're receding and others look like they're coming forward. Now it's time to block in her eyes, and I'm using watercolor pencils for this step. During this stage, I like to make sure that I leave room for the water lines and tear ducts of the eyes, and I also like to block in the eye creases and mark how I want the shadows to fall in those creases. I'm now starting to block in her irises, and she'll be getting big, beautiful brown eyes. When repainting dolls, you have to work in layers to build up the color. After each layer of pastels, I sealed them in using Mr. Super Clear, and I'm at a point now where my pencils aren't sticking to the plastic of the face, so I know that it's a good time to give it another layer and let it dry. Now I'm back and I've added more color to the irises, and I'm going to continue to give them more variation and details. I don't want them to lay flat, so adding in a variety of colors and details will make them look way more realistic. Now let's move down to the lips. Today I'm giving her a nude rose lip color. With her body and skeleton being really harsh and grungy, I want this aspect of her humanity to be really down to earth and naturally beautiful. So for the final details, I'm switching over to acrylic paints to add highlights to her lashes, eyes, lips, and waterlines to add a bit of life and sparkle to these areas. I really wouldn't consider a doll done without adding these little highlights because to me, they're what actually makes your doll seem to come to life. Now I need to add a stick to the mask so she can hold it. In the future, I think I want to do this with magnets, but I only had epoxy sculpt on hand, so I'm adding a glob to the back of the mask and squishing a skewer stick in there. Once it's dried, I'll paint the stick and cut it down to size for the doll to hold. So it's time to start constructing her outfit. In the story, Eurydice dies from a snake bite on her wedding day. So in my mind, that means she went down to the underworld in her wedding dress. So today, I'll be constructing a modern wedding dress for Eurydice. And I'm really excited to get started on her outfit because obviously after spending eons sitting around waiting in the underworld, her dress is going to have a lot of wear and tear. So that means I get to play with a bunch of different cosplay techniques to weather the fabric of her dress. Okay, so here we have our main pieces cut out of their fabric. For her dress, I'm going to be mixing this cute star-covered mesh with some other white fabrics I had in my stock. I thought the stars would be perfect because, hey, we're working on a constellation doll after all. For the first part of the dress, I'm constructing a triple layered skirt consisting of this floral fabric with 2 layers of mesh fabrics on top. I stacked these together, then added 2 gathering stitches, and now I'm gathering the whole thing to be the same length of the bodice. While I sew the skirt and bodice together with a zigzag stitch, let's talk about the bodice. For the top of the dress, I use 1 layer of the star mesh so her golden ribcage can show through. I made it off camera because it can be hard to see what you're doing when sewing small pattern pieces together, but then throw in white mesh and it would be crazy hard for me to see what I was doing and catch it on camera. So here's your first look at the bodice now that it's attached to the skirt, and now it's time to start making this dress look like it's been dragged through the muck for 1,000 years, and I'm starting by mixing some black acrylic paint into water to give the dress a gray gradient. The wash gave it a nice all-over grayish tint, but I want to push the black towards the bottom of the gown because that's what would be dragged through the dirt the most. Starting on the bottom, I'm applying black paint directly to the dress and fading it out. This fabric has a metallic-y sheen on the flowers, and adding the black paint is really making the flowers stand out, which I think is so cool. As I continue working, you'll see the more and more messy and hands-on I get trying to get the smears to look random but organic. I let the dress dry overnight, and now I'm going to try some cosplay methods of making the fabric look worn and naturally torn. I read that using a cheese grater can make natural-looking snags and holes in fabric, but for this one, it didn't work the best. That or I was too scared of scratching my hands up to really go for it. What really worked for the top mesh layers was this pet brush that I use for making yarn wefts. It was able to grab onto the little holes of mesh and snarl it up. Then for the thicker floral fabric, I had the best results using some straight up sandpaper. I was able to wear the fabric down and get some nice tears and rips. And now that it's all raggedy, I lost some of the stains we added with the black paint, so I'm coming back in and reapplying my paint washes. While the dress dries, I'm going to start working on the train of the dress. This is going to be sewn to the back of the dress, and I've gone ahead and ripped it to shreds too. And I just need to add some gathering stitches. The dress is dry and I closed up the back of the skirt, and now I'm going to hand stitch the train to the back. I didn't add a closure to the back of the bodice, and that's because after playing with it, I think the mesh would fit her torso better if I glued it directly to it. Not an ideal solution, but with how delicate the fabric is, this way was the best for me to close it without destroying the whole thing. So the constellation is called the Lyre Constellation, not the Eurydice constellation. So I think it's time to actually start working on our lyre, which Eurydices will wear as a headpiece. So I chose to make the lyre into a headpiece to connect the idea that Eurydice is connected spiritually to the heavens, which is exactly where the muses sent Orpheus's lyre when they made it into a constellation. To get started on the headpiece, I'm going to be making my own lyre, which I'm sculpting out of foam clay. I chose foam clay because it's super lightweight when it's dry, and I don't want to potentially weigh the head down with clays like Sculpey or Epoxy Sculpt. To the white clay, I'm mixing in some brown acrylic paint to give the clay a light brown base that I can build colors up on later. And now just sit back and relax and listen to the satisfying squish. I'm going to be cutting out the basic shape of the lyre, but before I can do that, I have to roll the clay out as evenly as possible into a little puck and then let it harden. Now that I have a solid clay puck, I'm using a stencil to draw on the lyre shape. The nice thing about foam clay is even when it's solid, it still has a spongy texture, and I can cut out using regular scissors and an X-Acto blade for the finer details. The edges are a little on the rough side, but we will finish these in a bit. Now I'm working out the perfect shape to cut the bottom of the lyre so it will rest snugly against the crown of the skull. Next up, I want the lyre to look like it's made of wood, so using 2 different shades of brown acrylic paint and a fine liner paintbrush, I'm adding in some wood grain details. With the basic wood grain blocked in, I'm now coming in with a wash that's basically acting like a wood stain. I want a smooth and solid application of the stain while still looking like the wood grain is showing through. An instrument played by the gods wouldn't be just plain wood, so off camera I made some ornate filigrees out of craft foam and painted them gold. And then I'm using some gold nail charms to add some leaf-like decorations. For the bridge of the lyre, I'm adding more nail charms directly below where I'll be adding the strings of the instrument. I'll be adding more details to make my lyre look more like the actual instrument later, but before I can do that, I need to clean up the edges of the clay. Wherever there's a raw edge, I'll be applying a thin layer of more foam clay, which I'll later paint gold to make it look like the edges are encased in golden gilding. So I've let everything dry, and the next part I'm going to add are the strings. In the foam, right above the bridge pegs, I've poked in some holes, and now I'm using some paper-wrapped floral wire for the strings. Now to add the little crossbar, which I'll secure in place using glue. From what I've seen, most lyres have some sort of tuning bulge. So for mine, I'm using these little rings that are used for jewelry making. For the last part of our headpiece, I'm going to be making a big voluminous veil inspired by this one, which I'll be attaching to the back of the headpiece. To attach the veil to the lyre, I cut out a piece of thin craft foam and I'm gluing it onto the back. Next, to give the veil lots of volume, I've taken half a styrofoam ball and I'm hot gluing on strips of weathered fabric. I'm really going to be trying to push the volume here, so I'm doing things like ruching the fabric and folding it in special ways to make it puff out. To shape it and make it look snarled and worn, I'm roughly coming in with my scissors. Once I'm done, I can then glue it onto the lyre's backing. Then I'm going to attach the lyre to the top of the skull with hot glue. A lot of hot glue. There's an ugly seam where I applied the hot glue, so to cover this up, I'm adding this golden chain, which I think almost mirrors the leafy details I added earlier. Now it's time to pop the skull on the body and we can get a full look at our finished doll. So here she is, friends, Eurydice and the Lyre, our first doll in my Constellation series. From merging 3 dolls together, weathering fabric, and making my own mini instrument, this repaint had a lot of different techniques for me to try out and experiment with. It was really fun being able to do what I would consider a typical face-up in a non-typical way, like we did for the mask, and I had a lot of fun weathering and griming up the skull. I will say that one thing I wish I did differently was add magnets to the mask and skull, because with the weight of the epoxy sculpt to the mask, she can't hold it up to her face on her own. I would have had to add magnets before starting the face-up, and by the time I realized my mistake, it was way too late. But, you know, it's things like this that help me get better on future dolls, so it's not a total loss. I would say that my favorite part of this doll was the lyre itself. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to add all the details that I wanted to add because I was working in such a small scale, but I'm really satisfied with all the little decorations, and even though the gilding on the edges was put there to cover up the rough cuts, I think it ended up looking really beautiful. So I'm not sure which constellation I'm going to be doing next, but I would love to get suggestions from you guys. Like I said, there are 88 of them, so if you have a favorite, be sure to let me know in the comments. And as always, I love to get your guys' feedback on what you think about my latest creation, so please be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps my channel out. Alright, Eurydice and I are gonna go pet Cerberus, but I will see you next time in another doll repaint video. Bye! To another doll repaint video.